Bonjour tout le monde. Alors aujourd'hui, on va parler de l'épée du soldat. So in one of my last videos, I talked to you about some of the first pattern of swords that were created by the French army, and which, to my knowledge, might have been some of the first official sword patterns ever issued to modern armies. Now, today we're going to be talking about another pattern that came very close to the what we call the Walloon hilt, and this is what we commonly call an Épée de Soldat. So an Épée de Soldat is a pattern that was created in 1680. So we're not exactly sure. We call it, we say a 1680 because that's about the period where they appear, but we don't have much documentation about this type of sword. What we do know is that following the release or the development of the Walloon hilt as an official French pattern, the French army also wanted to make something that was a little bit more French, so that was not would not make them as dependent on German exports to arm their soldiers. So they decided to try and create a type of sword that could be easily made in France. And so they came up with this model. And so it's very much like a beefed up, as you can see, a very large small sword. So the blade is much more like a spadroon, like some of the late Walloon hilts that you can sometimes see. So again, probably not extremely good for cutting, at least for this one. So one important thing about this pattern is that this is only one example of this pattern, right? There's many different variations. Some are not necessarily all solid brass. Some of them have wooden grips with brass wiring. Others have less of a small swordish appearance. Others have much beefier blade. And one interesting thing about this sword here is, I don't know if you can see, but the blade has visibly been reground several times. So it would have been slightly larger in its creation. So this blade was probably used by many soldiers and saw maybe a little bit of action and had to be resharpened or reground quite a lot. So one interesting thing about these swords is that they are among the first pattern to have brass fittings, brass guards. So before the turn of the 18th century, most of the sword that you see have rather steel guards, right? Because of course steel is tougher, in the long run it won't bend, won't break as much as brass, but brass is cheaper to make. Of course you can make a lot of guards, lots of fittings in a very short time. You just need to mold, create the mold, pour the brass, and then you can create a lot of parts very rapidly, whereas steel has to be made by a blacksmith individually, at least until machinery came up. So this is cheaper to make. Also, it's more simple to take care of, so it won't rust like steel does. So yeah, it's to arm soldiers. It's maybe a wiser choice for a large army to have brass instead of steel. And as swords start to not become such a prominent weapon on the battlefield, then it means that you might use your sword a couple of times in a battle. Maybe your guard will be a little bit bent, a little bit nicked, much more so than a steel guard would be, but it won't be destroyed either, because you're unlikely to use this as much as somebody, let's say in the 16th century, would have used a sword on a battlefield. So This is really a sign of the time around that period, and it's really the start of the new Bronze Age, as some people say in sword collecting, because suddenly bronze and the inside brass makes a return into swords. So this pattern was hugely popular. As I was saying before, it equipped the whole infantry line soldiers, and it was issued from 1680 up until 1763, around there. And this specific version, people think that it might actually be a surgeon's sword, not really an infantryman's regular private soldier sword, because of the little decorations here on the blade and on the guard, so that they're usually not found on private swords. But we don't really know for sure, because again, we don't have the exact models that were made to create these, and we don't really know the proper regulations around these swords. So they were used up until 1763, again in many different variations. The Walloon hilt was still used. Some regiments prefer to have the Walloon instead of the brass hilted Épée de Soldat. But by that time, what we see is that soldiers start to be very encumbered by this type of sword. It's a big sword to carry for a soldier that already has his whole pack, his gun, of course, bayonet. So to carry such a sword with it is becomes a little bit heavy, and it's not like a small sword. It does have some weight to it. It's much more like I would say a heavy spadroon. So on some actually period art, you can see soldiers equipped with these swords walking around with them, and in some scenes you see them using the swords as walking sticks. So they're usually in the scabbards, of course, and they're just long enough really to be a walking stick, and it really speaks as to how soldiers saw the sword as being kind of useless at that point as a weapon, and just good enough to be used as a walking stick. So by 1763, there's a whole rehaul of military equipment, and the French come up with a less encumbrant sword for the soldiers. They create the briquet, which we're going to be talking about in a future video. So this was the one of the last swords, full length sword that was equipped in the French army. And of course, officers will get to carry such swords for a much longer time. But that's for another video again. So these swords are really rare, apparently. Even though they're very rough, they're not extremely good looking, but they're fairly rare. They come in at a fairly good price, and I was lucky enough to find this one, because usually you have to pay a pretty good amount to get them. But why are they so rare? Because they were soldier swords, and they were property of the state, not of the individual soldier, unless he found a way to run away with it somehow. But usually when the pattern was superseded, they simply recycled these swords into other things, other swords or equipment, or just had the brass fitting melted, used for something else, use the blade for something else as well. So these blades are very rarely found because they didn't survive, and the French government didn't saw a need to keep them around. So I'm very glad I got this, because also, as you know, I'm from Quebec, and some of my ancestors were actually from France, and around the same time as this type of sword was carried. And going back a little bit, my family history, the first Chouinard that came to Canada came around in 1684, and we believe probably as a soldier. So he would have likely carried probably one of these swords or balloon hilt or some other type with him. So it's it's kind of related to me, I guess, and I always wanted to get one of these swords because I find them so interesting as part of sword history goes. So there you go, guys. That's for the Épée de Soldat. And we're going to be doing a little bit more videos about French soldiers and officer swords. So stay tuned, and if you have some questions about the sword, or if you want to see some videos about the swords I have behind me, or other subject, please ask me. I'll be very willing to do a video about this, and otherwise, see you soon.